Marhaba. Assalamu alaikum. Sabah al khair. Good morning, everybody. And welcome to the session. Thanks so much for coming because this is such a busy time of the year. And so I just wanted to introduce our distinguished speaker series. And we're fortunate to have with us Professor Dennis Sumara and his colleague Violet Barron, who are visiting scholars here this week at UCQ, and we'd especially like to welcome you from the other campuses. The series that we offer here at UCQ is an opportunity to bring in some leading speakers from around the globe, and also to share those with people from other institutions. So the Center for Teaching and Learning is going to coordinate the Distinguished Speaker Series each year, and so it's very much our pleasure to have you with us, Dennis and Violet, both today and an academic forum tomorrow and a symposium on Thursday. And I just wanted to mention we're also recording the session because we have Canadian colleagues working in Afghanistan who couldn't make it today and asked if...
What? Oh.
Hey?
Okay.
That was an exclamation, I think.
Yeah, turn it off for now.
It broke. Okay, so we're going to record this for our Canadian colleagues in Afghanistan, and we welcome you to join us for lunch afterward at noon, and there will be a time for any questions and things. I'd like to now call on Alison Toms, who's our Director of Human Resources, to please introduce Dennis and also Violet. And I wanted to ask you to do this because I know you worked with Dennis at the mothership. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ken. So it is a real pleasure and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Dennis Sumara. And it is a little odd that the Director of HR does this, but I've worked with Dennis Sumara for 4 years until coming to Qatar, and also with his Director of Faculty Operations, Violet. So I'll do a little bit of the paperwork where I have to check my notes here. Dr. Sumara has been with the University of Calgary for 4+ years, starting in the fall of 2009, and has been reappointed for a second term with the now Workland School of Education. We'll go back to that a little bit. Dennis has led one of the founding faculties at the University of Calgary in one of the oldest buildings on main campus. We have the largest number of graduate students at about 1,200, it's probably north of that now, and undergraduate population of probably 900. Dennis joined after terms at UBC, where you were the head of curriculum and pedagogy, University of Alberta, York University, Simon Fraser University, and before that he was a language arts teacher in southern Alberta in the Lethbridge area. Deep research interests, which you can read about more online, but some of them are about institutions, educational institutions as learning systems and institutions, so we're going to hear more about that today. Since coming to the University of Calgary, the provost has asked Dr. Sumara to take on a couple of additional roles. He led a committee that was looking at teaching and learning across campus, and which directly led to the founding of the Taylor, let me check this in my notes, the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, and we now have a new person leading that. He also co-chaired several campaigns for the University of Calgary United Way, and they were very successful. Those were the years where we started the stair climbs, which also helped get people fit as they raced up and down the 14 floors in the Education Tower building. He also has been very successful at attracting funding development funding to the Faculty of Education in areas as diverse as STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, ADHD, youth leadership, and most recently with the Workland Foundation, headed by the Workland family of David Workland, and that has resulted in the largest single donation to a school of education in Canada, and has been named now the Workland School of Education as of a month ago, only a month ago. So that's all the things you can read about. What I would like to say personally about working with Dennis is he came into a long-established faculty and really thoughtfully and personally wanted to meet everybody. In his first 2 weeks there, he invited everybody, students, staff, any faculty, to come and meet with him in small groups, to tell him the story about the faculty and our work there. He's instituted things that seem so simple but are so complex. It's an old building, and they're renovating it, moving the dean's office lower down in the building so it can be more accessible to students. He's improving student space. He is helping lead teams that review all of the programs, disbanding some, but creating new programs and strengthening curriculum review. He introduced a direct entry model so that high school students can go directly and study a Bachelor of Education, and it's been highly popular. Through all this, Dennis maintains a strong, open leadership style, and it was my pleasure to work directly for him for a year, and also to support them in my role as HR partner on campus. So I'd like to pass it over to you, Dennis. Welcome to UCQ.
Thank you. Test the sound. How's that? Feels very loud to me. Okay. Is it okay? Okay. Well, Allison, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and Ken, thank you so much for inviting me, and Kim, really appreciate the invitation to come to speak in your series. It's a long way from home, but we've been here for a couple of days, and it really is an amazing place to be, really. Wow. What a fantastic city and country. Look, I'm going to try to go quite quickly through my talk. I've got my little counter here. Ken told me I had 45 minutes. Now I've got 42. I'm going to actually spend quite a bit of time talking about one case study, one research project that colleagues and I did in several school districts in Alberta as a way of talking about what we learned that were quite surprising to us about educational change and how we can create it and move on. I've been now involved in education for about 34 years, and it's kind of interesting to me how persistent structures can be and how difficult it can be to change them. I wonder about that because we're in dire need of some change in education all over the world, but I think particularly in the West, we've got some challenges that we need to sort through, and probably a few barriers that we have to be open about and talk about quite honestly. So here we go. That's the title of my talk, a rather audacious title for a few simpler things that I want to say. See if that works. I want to start off by, this is my pitch wherever I go now, talking to other educators in the K through 12 system and post-secondary, talking to a lot of our donors, talking to stakeholders in the community. In fact, I was just out with our local politician working at a town hall meeting for parents, and this is how I started. Well, we've got some pretty big barriers in education. First of all, we still have that. Imagine. I mean, this was an okay idea, 150 years ago or so. But really, it doesn't work so well today. But we know that we've got an industrial model that still continues to organize a lot of our structures. I won't get into it. You know we've got it. It's a big challenge, and we need to think about how we're going to change that. It's not the world we're in. It's not the world we've been in for an awfully long time, and yet, we've got them. Well, as a result of that, we have a number of locked-in structures. In fact, Kim and I, we were talking about budget models. Now, who would have thought when I did a PhD in education, focusing on literature of all things that I've become interested in budget models, but I have. And I find it very interesting that we do have systems like budget models, policies, timetables, all kinds of things. I know we need structures, but some of them are very locked in. Carol Dweck's work to me is very interesting on mindset. Carol Dweck is a professor at Stanford. If you haven't read her book on mindset, you might find it interesting. I'll be talking much more about that on Friday. But we do have the opposite of a growth mindset. All children are born with this wonderful inquiring mind. They want to explore. They love new challenges. They take risks. And by the time our research shows that most young people, at least in Canada, are in grade 5, a lot of that is gone. We've been very effective at creating something quite different. And then, to all of that complexity, we try and apply simple solutions. So in my work in fundraising and fund development, here's what I say all the time, because I get people constantly who come and say, we've got a great idea for how we can fix education. If only we would do that. It's what we tend to do in education. We find something that sounds really kind of sexy and wonderful. Think, well, we'll do that. We'll put a lot of money into that thing, and that'll fix the whole problem. Well, there are no magic bullets. There are no simple solutions, but we like to believe there are. So today, I just want to talk about one study that we did. You can find it online. I'm just going to give you the backstory very quickly, because I don't have a lot of time. When I was living in British Columbia, I heard a lot about a program in Alberta called the Alberta Initiative for School Improvement. This came out of the Ministry of Education, and what they had decided was they really wanted to have a teacher-led approach to trying to improve student achievement, right? Alberta is one of the provinces where we still do provincial achievement testing, so it's not hard to track if changes in practice can improve at least that way of marking achievement. So what they did over the course of 10 years, it was almost $1 billion. They sent money out into every school jurisdiction on an amount per pupil. And it was targeted for projects in schools, in school jurisdictions that had the potential to change and improve student achievement. There were some criteria. They had to be research informed. There had to be data gathering. You had to have proof that what you were doing worked. But school jurisdictions were given a lot of autonomy for the way they would do that. Some made decisions to have one big project in the school. So there was one that said, okay, we're going to have a literacy focus. We're all going to work on that. And then there were others who said to teachers in schools, you know something? Teachers have really good ideas. You're working on the front lines of practice. If 2 or 3 or 4 of you want to get together and apply for some funding, not a lot of funding, but some, to work on something that would be research active and research informed, we're going to give you that opportunity. Our job, this was led by Andy Hargraves at Boston College, a number of us came together to do all these different kinds of research to find out if it was working. What advice did we have for government? This was about year 7 of the project. As it had been unrolling, they wanted to know, was it working? Should they keep on doing it? What were the different effects around the province? So I'm not going to talk about the first one. The quantitative analysis was done by Bob Crocker, and what he did, he looked at all the achievement test results, and he looked at all the different kinds of quantitative measures that had been taken and came up with a bit of a report which you can read online. Dennis Shirley and his colleagues in Boston, they went and they looked at what schools were doing. So they went to a number of schools across Alberta, and they really wanted to see what the schools were doing. You can read that part. My colleagues Brent Davis and Lissa Demour, we were asked to apply a complexity framework to a whole school district. Now, does everyone know what that would be? And I better explain that. In Alberta, there are about, 40 or something school jurisdictions or school districts. They are led by an elected board of trustees, and they all report to the Ministry of Education. Each school jurisdiction would have a superintendent or a chief superintendent, depending upon their size, a variety of different schools, elementary, secondary, middle schools, all led by principals. And this all works together as a system. Well, we wondered, and it's all, by the way, it's all written up. Our part is written up in this one article. So if you don't want to read the whole Learning Mosaic one and are more interested in this, we can actually provide that to you, Ken, and send it around. Here's what we wanted to know. Could we bring a complexity systems theory approach to a major strategic initiative? We hear about them all the time. Post-secondary has them. Health organizations have them. Almost every kind of institution will have some kind of big, majorly funded strategic initiative. Could we learn something by bringing that approach to it? Okay, this is the very quick. Normally, My colleague Brent Davis would do an hour and a half on complexity with you. I'm going to do 1 minute. That's all the time I have. So what is it? Well, for an educator, it would be the study of learning systems. If you're a biologist or an anthropologist or an archaeologist or a neuroscientist, you'd have a different definition of it. But as an educator, that would be mine. But the major definition is it's any kind of a complex system is coherent, dynamic, developing phenomena, right? So an organization definitely could be one. If you're working from another research perspective, you could be studying anthills, which are learning systems, the stock market, we see how it goes up and down, hearts, people, social groups, cultures, the biosphere, anything that has to respond and adapt complexly and interact. I think this sounds like common sense, but 20 years ago, the discipline didn't really exist. It's come together as an interdisciplinary field of learning. People from all disciplines are trying to look at how things like a community, a family, an educational system all works together and actually as an organization changes. Does a school district fall into that category? And what would happen if you collected data and thought about it in that way? We brought two big questions to it, and I think these are really important questions to bring to any system that we're trying to change. What is the ongoing internal narrative? So if you're going into a system as a new faculty member, as a researcher, as a leader, this is what we're always trying to find out, right? What is the discourse we're walking into? What is the history of events that have brought people to think the way they think, to believe the things they believe, to act in the way they do? It really is bringing a kind of an anthropological, ethnographic attitude to your work as a school leader. And how is it networked? So how is it, literally, that people are networked, how systems are networked that actually create number one or support number one? So here are some questions that began to emerge as we looked at the data. Here's what we did. A team of 3 went into every school district for about 5 days. We spent time with all stakeholders. We had meetings. We went into schools. We talked to a number of different people. We really tried to get a sense of what was going on in the district. We looked at a number of different artifacts. That's the 30-second overview of the data gathering part. And then as we were starting to analyze it, here are some questions that emerged. And I think it's a really important question for anyone working in an organization. How does the organization conceive of its work? Like, what is the work? How do you think about it at a conceptual level? And how does that conceptual, that concept influence how people think about themselves as learners, contribute to roles and relationships in a district or an institution like Calgary, CADR, inform organizational structures? Does it? It probably informs the ones that we can control, right? You can't control all of them. And frame the way in which a strategic initiative is taken up. Here's what was really interesting. One would think that if you had the same rules, the same criteria for the way in which targeted funding could be used, you pretty much have the same kind of effect across a whole province or a state, right? Absolutely not. There was such a variety, a huge difference across different jurisdictions, and we really couldn't figure out why at first. Now, what I want to do is quickly take you through, and then we're going to get to the stuff that relates more to what you're doing. Here's what we learned very quickly about 3 different school districts that we visited. They were all so different from one another. These are all pseudonyms, of course. They ranged in size and placement in the province. This particular one was kind of a smaller urban area with some rural influences. Here's what we learned. And I'm just going to go through here. There are quotations that we've taken from the data to give you a sense of how this district felt to us and the way they conceived of their work. This came from a senior leader. Well, I think it came from actually the school superintendent. Does that sound familiar? You can imagine how the schools felt about that. Right? So these are just examples of what we heard over and over again. Is everyone able to read that? Can you see it? Well, you wonder why that might happen. That never happens here, right? No. So AZ was the Alberta Initiative for School Improvement. That was the actual strategy. That's how it was known. And what they're talking about is, so we have a grand plan. This was a district where they said, look, we're getting all this money. We're not going to parse it out into 100 projects. We're going to have one, big one. And we're going to just tell the school principals and the teachers that they're going to do that one, and they're going to do it in this way, and we're going to centralize it all. When we went out in the schools, the teachers were telling us, I actually don't think the people who have the money know what our work is or what they're doing, and they're certainly not talking to each other. So a lot of disconnection is happening. This refers to the way in which the teachers felt that not only was it not supporting their work, it was creating a layer of work that really wasn't appreciated. Because if you're teaching in the school system and you need to go out and do professional development work, it can be really fantastic if you find it valuable, or it can be another job because you're preparing for substitute teachers. So we concluded that this particular district conceived of their work as management, right? That what they were doing is they were saying this is a big management problem. We're going to do it in the most efficient way possible. When Bob Crocker went through and looked at a lot of the achievement results, do you think they did very well? Not really. Right? The next one, very different kind of district, a little bit more urban, but still a bit of a rural influence, a little larger. I want to give you a sense of different things they were doing. Yeah, I spend 2 or 3 days a week coaching teachers with new ideas and practices I've learned. It's a different kind of a feeling there that you can tell already they're doing something different, right? I would leave the sorting through all the research to the consultants, let them figure out what's going on and sharing it with us. You'll see where that's going. We buy into these projects quickly because we trust the people that are offering them. So again, a very different kind of a feel. We know when it's coming down the pipe that's tried and true based on good research. We're willing to put our efforts into it. And this initiative has helped us to create whole new networks of support that were not there before. We're now a whole new organism, like radically different, completely different. Same initiative. So what did they do differently? Well, they took all of the money from the strategic initiative, looked at their organization and said, what are we missing? And I'll talk a bit more about this when I get into the network theory. What that district was missing was a layer of expertise. And they decided they were going to hire it. They were going to hire experts in a number of disciplines who were really good teachers. They centralized them, and then they spread them out throughout the whole district to go into schools and offer professional development support and coaching and expertise that was research informed and research active. Very interesting, and I think really, really productive. Well, they did conceive of their work as service, but service to one another. How are we going to use that money in a really productive way to help each other improve our own practice? I'm going very quickly because I want to get to the other part. This last district should not have been as great as it was. Much more of a rural district where the schools were really spread apart, right? So not that many students, which meant they didn't have that much money because it was given per pupil. But absolutely extraordinary. This is the first thing we heard when we met with the Board of Governors and the superintendent. When we asked them, what do you think your main job is? Well, learning is the work. Things are always changing in our district. We know that if 3 of us decide to do it, it takes the riskiness out of it. We can push ourselves further individually because we have support. That's what you want to hear, right? There is an openness. The leader who leads all that is the conscience of the admin team. Isn't that a great term? Right? Or we ended up calling that almost like the consciousness of. He is the person people look to in the system to say difficult things. Well, you know that when you're in the middle of any kind of a change, professional development process, it's not all good. Somebody has to be able to say, those difficult things. How does it inform instructional organizational structures? Well, again, a very important concept connected to learning. We have a respect for diversity. We can't all walk down the same road together at the same time. We hear about it all the time, a respect for diversity, but we hardly ever use the diverse perspectives we have. We hear about them. We don't use them. And then they thought that the whole strategic initiative was very catalytic, like a spark in the network. 3 completely different districts, where each of them had a very different conception of what their primary work was that led them to use the money and the strategy in very, very different ways. So what we asked next is, okay, we've got three very different kinds of discourse systems, and they are historical, right? What we learned from the last district, the Pathways one, the one that was so productive, and they were doing incredibly well in improving student learning and achievement exams. When I asked the superintendent, why is it so great? Like, what are you doing? And he said, look, this started 10 years before. 10 years before I came here, there was a superintendent in place who decided that teachers should work together. And through a reallocation of budget, created an opportunity for them to work in professional learning communities, provide that kind of support. The whole thing was in place so that when the opportunity came to add a whole new resource layer in terms of this initiative, they put the money into an already very productive learning system. So we thought, well, let's try and figure out how all these different systems were networked. And many of you I know are familiar with network theory. I'm not going to go through all of it today. But again, all emergent phenomena, all complex systems are networked in different ways. So we wanted to know how these three were networked and if it would help us to better understand what we could recommend with other kinds of change processes. So this is to me, a very interesting way of looking at different kinds of networks. Here's one. And it's not always bad, right? So sometimes you actually do need to have a highly centralized system. Anytime you have an emergency, right, it makes sense that one person be in charge of all the communication. Now, these can be either fantastic or terrible. If you've got the right leader, right, a highly centralized system can be pretty good. If you don't, it can be pretty terrible. And from a network perspective, a complexity perspective, it's not very adaptive because we know that it's only as adaptive as the hub. You change the hub and then we've got this kind. And you know, this is the kind that you often get, I'll show later in a different slide, when you've got no strong vision, no strong leadership, and sometimes when you have too much resourcing. I'm aware this is being recorded, and I should never say that out loud. Is there a possibility of too much? But there is, right? It is possible that I know that's not happening here, but it is possible that everyone could be funded or be able in different ways to do what he or she wants to do. Their programs could proliferate. Certainly happened in our home province for a while, right, Kent? You were there. And when I came to the University of Calgary, I said, well, you know, we don't have nearly as much funding as we had 10, 15 years ago, but guess what? We have everything that we built for the last 20 years, and now we're trying to take care of it all. That's not going to work. So it's not uncommon in organizations that you have that kind of very distributed system. And by the way, the dots in those two are in exactly the same place, where the communication is very poor. You're only communicating with the person next to you, and it's not very adaptive. It's very hard to fix that kind of a system. Then we've got this one. Now, from a complexity studies perspective, this is the hallmark of a really robust, highly adaptive learning system. If you look at the map of the internet, that's what it looks like. You can take a number of nodes out, it's not going to collapse. If you look at the way the brain is networked, that's what it looks like. If you look at really highly functioning cities that are livable, that's the way they're organized. That's what we're looking for. And then we've got this kind, which is also very common, because we actually have figured out in organizations that people should be working in groups, that it should be project-based, that we should prioritize programs. After going on the tour with Ken yesterday of what's happening here in Doha, pretty sure that's where you are. It's not bad. It's actually very easy to fix. The good news is this is actually quite far along in an evolutionary process. It really is. That's a very easy one to bring together, and we'll talk about how in a moment. You know, and so you can see the commentary in the bottom there. It's not coherent yet, but it has enormous potential. And you know, we found, for example, in one of the districts that that's exactly where they were, and they had a rationale for using strategic funding to bring that together. Remember the one I told you where they hired the consultants to come in? Well, they recognized that's where they were. They actually had really good schools. They were doing good things. They had a really good vision. What they needed were people, right? Connectivity is not just putting a chart on paper. Connectivity means hiring people. You're going to be a connector. You're going to be a connector. You're going to connect these two, and we're going to pay you to do that. That's going to be your mandate. If you don't, well, that was your job, actually, when Allison came in to the University of Calgary. I said, well, who's the executive director? They said, we don't have one. I said, that is not going to work. We need to have somebody to come in here. It's exactly how Violet's job was organized on this theory. As we evolved our faculty and started doing all kinds of things, I said, well, we need to hire someone, who is going to manage and make sure that all these things are connected. That is her full-time job. And I think we use 3 of her right now. But let's talk about, that's the one we're aiming for. If you want a really robust learning system, that's the picture of it. Now, this normally came up as an animated one thing at a time, and that a lot of information up there that I want to take you through a little bit more slowly, because this chart kind of shows, in terms of the data I presented earlier, how one district evolved from one to the other and the kind of factors that cause that. I think it's really important to go in and say, where are we? What is our story? What is our history? How are we currently networked? If we had an opportunity, either through extra funding resources or people or idea resources, how would we use them and why? Well, if you look over here at the middle, right? If you look at the research, this is what often happens. You can have a really great decentralized system, and if you over-resource it in different ways, you can quickly move into a much more distributed one. But let's look at what happened with the 3 districts. This particular one, the first one I talked about, which sounded so dreadful, remember? The management thing? Well, when we really went more deeply into the data and looked at their history and looked at the interviews with the superintendent, the leaders, and a number of the people that were trying to make changes, we realized they had been there several years before. There was absolutely no communication between schools in that district. Somebody said they were, yeah. So when you've got people who are not communicating, when there's no big vision, when there's no obvious goals in a particular area, everyone's doing their own thing, that's not very good. That's not a very good learning system. When that superintendent came in, she said, look, we have to do something. I've got to pull this group together. Something has to happen. So when they had the opportunity for the strategic initiative, she said, look, let's have one big project. Let's do that. Let's start there. But if you stop there, then you've got other kinds of problems, right? It's not ideal to go from here to here. The goal is then to go from here, probably you're going to end up going down there. What was happening in that school jurisdiction when we went around to the schools, we saw that different schools actually, even with a mandated one district focus, had some very interesting ways in which they were taking it up. The second one, the one that had the service layer pulled in, well, they actually had been in the same kind of situation, right? They were a different situation. They were over here. So a while back, they had been like this. When we went through their history, we understood that when they first started the AZ projects, they did have a centralized project. They'd gone there. Then they went down there, and the reason they wanted to use their money to bring in connectors and people to actually lead that connectivity is they're deliberately trying to go from here to here. That's the kind of system, and they did it, actually. When I communicated later with different leadership, they had achieved that goal. This one, when we actually probed into the history of that district and the way in which they had changed over 10 or 15 years, we realized that they had evolved from this kind of a district to that, and they were finally there. And it is absolutely amazing and fascinating to watch how much they could do with so little. Because keep in mind, again, they had very few pupils. And when you give money per pupil, a whole district can end up with less resources but end up being able to do more. So, the most fascinating one, and this is the learning I took away from it that stays with me today, If you find out where you are, if you're coming into a new situation, which many of you did when you came to work here in Doha, you have to find out what the history, what the discourse systems are, what the policies and processes are, what are all the narratives that are guiding your area, your institution, your district. Whatever the new resourcing, whatever the strategic initiative will be, guess what it does? It amplifies what you already have. If your orientation is management-driven and instrumental, and you put a new initiative in there, the tendency will be to do that, unless you make some kind of a change. The second one, we also learned that having to grapple with new resourcing and accountability has catalyzed some evolutions. So we know that can also happen. That if you add accountability with resourcing, it can make some, it can affect some big changes. So I think in terms of my own work, in working as an academic leader in an organization that's gone through a tremendous amount of change, the thing that we really needed to do is to influence the narratives and the networks. So what did we do at, do you call it main campus here? What do you call it? The other University of Calgary. Well, what did we do when we came into the Faculty of Education? Great place, a lot of amazing talent. But we had to find out how we could catalyze and bring together that talent in different ways by looking at where they had been. What were the dominant narratives? What were the organizational structures? I mean, Allison is very aware of this. When I came in, I think in the first week I said, okay, you know, we've looked at the history of the place. It was about 42 or 43 years old then. A lot of innovation had happened over that time. I looked at the way in which it was organized and structured, and I said, look, we're going to do 4 things at about the same time. We're going to look at our academic programs, and we're going to have 2 different task forces to do that because we have to improve them. We're going to look at all of our organization and governance. How are we organized and governing ourselves, and is that actually productive? Is that helping us to meet the needs of students, or is it getting in the way? And then we had a very interesting one that we called reputation, resources, and something else that began with an R. We brought people together to look at all that as well. So a couple of lessons for institutions. Every institution has an existing mindset. I mean, this is the question for you. What is your institution's mindset? Is it fixed? Does it like new challenges? Does it want to really take risks? And are you able to do that? Because, of course, we all say we like to take risks, but in institutions, we hate that normally, right? We're very risk-averse because we're accountable. Any new funds that come in, any new initiatives come in, we're very accountable. So what is it? It's very, very important that we try and figure out what that is before we start to apply an initiative. And the second one is the way in which an organization is networked is strongly influences and its ability to adapt and change. So how are people actually connected? It was quite interesting this morning. I came in to your meeting just briefly, and you could see the engagement around the table, and I thought, pretty well networked already. So we've got all the different leaders who are running different parts of the organization, who have pretty good relationships with one another, very good communication about what's happening. If you get that kind of strong connectivity and communication going, you can probably adapt to change much more quickly. What can we do? Well, do that. Identify where they are. It's a very interesting exercise to go through. How do you find out? You have to talk to people. That's what Allison said earlier. Get small groups of people in a room, find out how they talk about the organization. What kind of metaphors do they use? What kind of language are they using? What do they refer to? Try to figure out how it's currently networked. And that's not just the formal org chart. That's not going to help you very much. That's not really what we're looking for. How are people informally networked? Who's talking to who? Who are the influencers? How are decisions actually made, right? Well, it's very important to find that out. I mean, I can try to mandate some kind of a change in our school, but if I don't understand how people actually take up decisions, how they communicate, how they understand that, it probably won't work. I think it's really important to create and support decentralization. That old idea, that not very good idea, that leadership comes up with big ideas and just dumps them on the institution and says, well, go do that, and report back at the end of the year. We know that won't work. By decentralized, I mean that you need a couple of things going on at the same time. Of course, people have to lead in their portfolios. Many of you are doing that, including your own classroom as a portfolio, by the way. What you're doing in a classroom is working with part of the network. But for me, the important learning was we have to figure out who, in addition to leading the portfolio, and these may be different people, are going to be hired to connect components, pull things together, right? So how are we going to figure that out in the organization? What are those, who are those people? What are their titles? And what are their responsibilities? Well, this is a very interesting one. That over-resourcing is just as bad as under-resourcing. There is an optimal amount, and that's money, that's people, that's all forms of resourcing, including ideas. So what we'd like to do in education, because we're so generous, is say, look, we'll take on any new idea, we'll keep on adding to our curriculum, it doesn't matter how many things we have to pull in. Well, we know that that's not going to work either. So really trying to figure out what the optimal level of resourcing is quite important. And we've talked about that one. People have to be assigned to be connectors and leaders and take that role very seriously. That's a really robust form of decentralized governance. A very hard one. So, that first slide I showed you about we've got complex organizations and we apply simple solutions. If only we did one thing, everything would get better. Well, absolutely won't happen. If we are really serious about dramatically changing from what I talked about earlier, this industrial model, into something that's going to be a much more situated learning, inquiry-based, engaged learning environment, that's what we want, right? Most of the research has shown that's how people learn best. Interdisciplinary learning where specialization is valued, people working on teams. How are we going to do that? Well, we have to probably do about 5 or 6 very significant things at about the same time, which is very difficult for people, right? We always talk about learning as disequilibrium, but we hate being in it. Very challenging to be in that kind of a situation. So for an educational institution, I say, look, you've got to work on your curriculum. Absolutely. What is being taught and why? You really need to work on what we're calling at the Workland School of Education. What are your signature pedagogies? What are the ones that everyone's going to work on in a very deep way? And how are we going to create that kind of framework? What are we doing about our organization and governance? Is it preventing us from being good at what we want to do in the other areas? So if we say we value interdisciplinary participatory learning, how's it going to work if people are in different departments and they don't even know each other, right? Are we going to say, well, try to get together once in a while? Well, good luck with that, because people are very busy working in each of their areas. There isn't that kind of time or opportunity. So if we actually want people to collaborate in a meaningful way, we're going to have to incent that. And we're probably going to have to really think about the current way in which we organize and structure. To me, what's so interesting right now about what's happening in Doha is we've got all of this amazing expertise from all around the world in our various institutions that are being represented here. Is there yet a really good opportunity for you to work together? Maybe not, but it's an easy problem to fix, right? It really isn't that difficult. Once you have the people here and all those things established, the rest can happen with a few small shifts. Is that it? That's all you have to do. Just a few things like that. So I do apologize for not giving you too much more of the background on the theory, the references. I thought it would be much more beneficial just to go over very quickly one case study. I thought it was quite illuminating how three places that should have had very much the same results were radically different from one another based on their own self-narrative, the way they were networked, and really the way it can be changed, not easily, but can be changed by having a different perspective and thinking about how we can do things simultaneously. If you do want to know more, a lot of those ideas are in the one book my colleague Brent Davis and I wrote on complexity in education, where we move through the theoretical components, the kind of descriptive, the way in which complexity came to be a very good way of describing existing phenomena. And now we're at a place in education where complexity studies can inform what to do. It's very pragmatic, and we need it to be right now. What can we do to get out of this kind of locked-in industrial mindset, industrial model fixed mindset situation that we're in? And the other book is the one that I'm very proud of. It's our one that we do in teacher education that we call Engaging Minds, which surprisingly I find is being used by a lot of other professions because we think very differently about how to organize a curriculum. That's it. How did I do? Where's my time? I am at... Thank you. Did I do it? So I promised Ken that I would try to finish in about 45 minutes so that we would have time for any questions or comments or advice that you might have for me. How much time do we have, Ken? It's 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 12 o'clock?
Maybe 10 minutes.
Okay. Yep. We could spend an hour on this one, actually.
When you said the arrow pads moved, when they did change, instead of going off to the right, it was decentralized, so you went down to the fragmented. Why is it so difficult to go from centralized immediately to decentralized? Do you have to go to fragmented, or do people typically, or can you explain that a bit?
Well, I think it's the process, right? So if you're in an environment where people have not collaborated, let's talk about it in the way it actually works, where people have not been given an opportunity to work together in small groups in meaningful ways. That it's very hard to move from being completely isolated, working independently, to a situation where you're working in smaller groups in your program areas and then having all of those connected. So for example, what I've already learned here about the nursing program, I think the people do collaborate pretty well. That's my sense in the program. I'm hoping you do. The next step would be the whole system is not just you, Calgary, Qatar. The whole system would be all the other program areas here in Doha. Well, that's another set of strategies and connectors that has to be put in place in order to take it to the next level. It can happen. I think it's rare.
Wouldn't the director just need to assign some leaders within these decentralized bits that are maybe elected from the group or somehow selected some consensus for, thereby creating a more decentralized model rather than wasting time through the fragmented?
Yeah. Ideally, that would work, but do you know how challenging it is? The solution that you're proposing is one that would work. But think about what we would need to do, and I recommend that we do it. When you get an amount of funding, not just for a strategic initiative, but let's just call it your budget. How often do we allocate a portion of our budget for anything like that? Right? It's very rare that we would say, look, in addition to the people that we normally need to do the everyday work of our mandate, we also are going to take part of our budget and we're going to create the conditions to hire people to do that kind of connecting work. Because it is work, right? It's administrative work. It's planning work. It's coaching work. It's bringing people together and helping them to collaborate work. So we tend to do it on a consulting level. Organizations will hire a consultant to come in for a brief period of time to do it. And there actually can be a pretty good effect in the short term. But what would happen if we actually built it into the organization, which is why I like that particular picture, because it starts to help us to understand what to do when you're working out the budget. It's what we did in our organization, our new organizational structure in the School of Education. The first thing we did, we eliminated our divisions, which were like departments. I said, look, that's not going to work. They really are dividing, and not in a very productive way. And let's figure out a different way of assigning leadership to program areas and then creating governance structures that actually require people to come together, require them to come together on a regular basis to share, to collaborate, and to make decisions for the whole organization in that way. I think you were first then there.
I'm curious about the industrial model and how it fits, because I hear you saying decision-making, leadership, and we know there's formal leaders.
Is that me? Sorry. Hello? Hello? Yep, sorry.
We know there's formal leaders and informal leaders. And I'm just curious, do you think the model where there are a lot of departments,
Yep.
isn't that more like an industrial model of directing decision-making?
Sure. It can be.
Where does the leadership, like when you have an academic setting and you've been in a professoriate, like a faculty position, there's the idea of the shared governance model where decision-making is shared among people and everyone is a leader to a certain degree. In some ways, the informal leaders have more of a leadership role than those formal leaders that get, say, heads of departments who are directing more the structural piece of how the organization runs. So I'm just curious, do you see a link between that modeling where there are departments and leaders of those departments and an industrial model?
Well, sure. I mean, let me say first, I would never want us to eliminate any of our disciplines or our disciplinary knowledge. It's super important to what we're doing in post-secondary. But what I'm talking about with the industrial model is what we do with knowledge within the context of the curriculum, right? And the way that we teach it. In terms of our own organization, in most post-secondary settings, the problem we have is that we don't require people to knowledge produce together. We just don't. So it does happen in a very informal way, just what you're talking about. We do have leaders throughout the organization that do meet regularly. They strategize. They think about how they're going to move the organization forward. They do it in a very collaborative and interdisciplinary way. But if you look at the org chart, you'd never see it, right? So I think there are ways. It's happening in business all over the world. I mean, we used to think that we should never borrow any ideas from business, but I think there are business models that are highly collaborative, highly interactive in that way, where leaders are required to work in that kind of way, not just recommended. The recommended never works. It has to be required in terms of your own decision making. You had a question right back there.
And that you talked to people broadly.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the differences among these three schools and how surprising those differences were. And you referenced the outcomes, the sort of standardized testing that were different among these three schools. But I didn't hear you talking about what was actually different in the classrooms. So how did these models that sort of filtered down differently and then got tested differently, how did they arise in the actual work of teachers and what was going on with students in classrooms?
So it's a great question, and what what that particular initiative was getting at was really across the board trying to improve student learning and achievement. What we noticed, especially in the one district, is they had made a commitment to a much more inquiry-based, situated learning model, right, where teachers would dramatically have to change their practice. It's not the way we were educated. And it certainly is not the way most of teacher education has prepared teachers or the way we were prepared to teach going into post-secondary. I mean, when I was a graduate student, you were prepared to give a lecture, you were prepared to lead a seminar, but we weren't really necessarily prepared to work from a case study, situated learning, problem-based, inquiry-based learning model. What they had decided over a period of many years, actually, it didn't start in a minute, was they were going to support that kind of learning, and through both a coaching model and a professional community learning model, that they would slowly start to change the way in which they were teaching. It took a number of years. So we saw evidence of a lot of that. But you know what the most important thing was? Because they were connected in a very important way with parents and with board of trustee members who are very influential in what's going to happen, right? So we often hear, and you might even hear it here, I'm not sure how involved you are with parents in post-secondary, probably not so much, but you do have students that come in who have been through our schooling system. And if you try something new with them, like, okay, today, instead of taking notes and writing an exam, we're going to give you this, and you'll get a lot of resistance, right? I'm sure you will. There's cultural resistance, but there's also resistance because of the way in which we've been socialized as students in the schooling system. What they had done over a period of years, because they were so highly connected and kept people in the loop, is they were starting to change perception in the community. Right? I think that was one of the things they had done really, really successfully. It's what we have to continue to do. In our new Bachelor of Education program, we have to continue actually to try to re-socialize students into a very different kind of learning system. It's not the one they came out of at all. What we say is, look, we're preparing you not for current practice, but next practice. It's the next one. It's the one that we expect to happen over the next number of years. You have to lead it. So what you have to do is be really good at what currently exists. You have to know it. That's what you're walking into. But you also have to be very competent at where we're going. And they had really focused on that. The combination of where we're at, where we're going, and getting everybody on board, right? Really through a strong educational process in the community. Great question. Thank you. Anything else? Ken's going to make me stop.
Maybe one more question before we...
Yep. I'll do 1 minute on that, because what happened in our particular province is that over time, through a big public consultation, we have a completely different vision of education on 3 new principles. So the question was asked of citizens, teachers, students, what should the educated Albertan be like in 20 years? Here were the 3 principles. Engaged thinker, ethical citizen, with entrepreneurial spirit. And entrepreneurial, not that you're starting a business, but you'd be a creative thinker. Well, it's a great vision. In the process of implementing that over the next 3 years, there's going to be a radical change in curriculum and a reconsidering of how we assess students. It's a small thing, but we're withdrawing a number of the end-of-the-year achievement exams for younger children. And instead putting in a process of really trying to track the assessment for learning processes that we're using, and much more qualitative analysis of student learning over time. So it's all got to change. Somebody asked me recently, why are you still grading in the way you're grading in post-secondary? I said, look, we have to change the whole system, K through 20. One of the reasons that we have to do it is because you are sending us those students who have been so beautifully socialized to expect that if they write that paper, they should get this mark. Well, if we're going to change our system, of course we have to do something at the teacher education level, and we are. But let's start in grade 1. Let's start by working people through a completely different system where we do assessments in a much more responsible way that's connected to what we're actually teaching and what we actually want our students to be good at when they leave our systems. So, great question. We looked at those achievement results because that was the only consistent data source we had for comparison across those systems, and there were differences. You will still find that if you have students in a classroom environment with that approach to teaching, even just that as a measure, it will improve. Without focusing on exams, but focusing on learning, guess what happens? Students do better on exams, right?
Well, thank you very much, Dennis, for
Thank you.
sharing this session with us. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed, the session in the sense that I've thought for quite a while now that anthropological, ecological perspectives for understanding our institutions was very important, and I think your your models and explanation of how networks evolve really helps us to understand the change process. I think a lot of times we really want to change, but it needs to be a cultural shift. And so these models give us a way of knowing and a sense of a way of working. And so thank you very much, for this session. So I'd like to invite you all for, some lunch now and more chance to catch up and have a chat with Dennis.
Thank you, everyone.